Imagine this. You're barely 12 years old, dressed in a gown that feels heavy on your tiny frame, and tonight is your wedding night. You've never spoken to the man waiting for you. He's 3 times your age, a powerful lord who purchased you from your father the way a farmer might buy livestock. The church bells are still echoing in the night air, the feast outside still roaring with laughter, and yet, in the dim candlelight of a stone chamber, the real ritual is only just beginning. You think marriage is about love, honor, or devotion. In the Middle Ages, it was nothing of the sort. A medieval wedding was not the end of a romantic story. It was the beginning of a nightmare. Behind the legends of knights and castles lies a truth so brutal that it was deliberately erased from history books. Wedding nights were not private moments. They were spectacles of power, humiliation, and control. What you are about to hear will shatter every illusion about medieval romance. These are the terrifying secrets of medieval wedding nights. Secrets that turned bedrooms into theaters of abuse and brides into victims of a system designed to break them from the very first night. When people today imagine the Middle Ages, they often picture grand castles rising above green hills, knights kneeling before kings, or courtly lovers exchanging secret letters in candlelit chambers. What almost no one imagines is what marriage actually meant to the ordinary people, and especially to young girls who lived under the crushing weight of that society. To truly understand the terror of medieval wedding nights, you have to strip away the romanticized images left behind by poets and storytellers, and look instead at the cold machinery of law, religion, and custom that dictated every aspect of a woman's existence. For centuries, marriage in medieval Europe was never a private union of 2 souls. It was a binding transaction in which the woman was treated not as a partner but as property, transferred from the ownership of her father to that of her husband in a ritual sanctified by both church and state. The Catholic Church, which dominated every sphere of life in Europe between the fall of Rome and the dawn of modernity, reinforced the idea that women were spiritually weaker, morally unstable, and physically designed only to serve men. Church fathers declared that Eve's sin had cursed all women with inferiority, and from this theological position flowed centuries of legislation, sermons, and rituals that justified turning marriage into a holy form of bondage. The doctrine of obedience was preached in pulpits, written into law codes, and repeated at every wedding ceremony where the bride promised to serve and obey while the groom promised only to protect and command. Legal documents from this period revealed just how systematic this framework was. Marriage contracts resembled contracts for land or livestock, with precise details about the bride's dowry, her family's property, and the expectation that she would provide heirs for her husband's line. For the medieval family, daughters were commodities whose value lay not in who they were, but in what alliances they could forge. A nobleman might use his daughter to secure political peace with a rival family. A merchant might sell his daughter to gain access to a trading network, and even peasant families treated daughters as financial burdens who could be converted into resources by marrying them off. The younger the girl, the higher her value in these transactions, because a child bride was easier to control, less likely to resist, and offered the possibility of many childbearing years. Parents and guardians rarely thought of marriage in terms of happiness or compatibility, but only in terms of survival, property, and inheritance. This social framework was reinforced by the medical beliefs of the time, which were themselves deeply influenced by religious dogma. Physicians and clerics alike taught that women's bodies were incomplete versions of men's bodies, fragile and unstable, prone to disease if not controlled by a husband's authority. Medical texts recommended that girls be married as soon as they reached puberty, or even earlier, claiming that early intercourse would stabilize their humors and prepare them for motherhood. These recommendations were not acts of ignorance alone. They were tools of control that normalized the exploitation of young brides, framing abuse as divine order and scientific necessity. The very sciences of the day were bent to serve the institution of ownership. The evidence for this system comes from court records, chronicles, and private letters that somehow escaped centuries of censorship. Legal disputes reveal how husbands sued their in-laws if a bride was discovered to be infertile, as though they had been sold a defective animal. Letters describe girls being examined by midwives before marriage to confirm their virginity, their teeth and hips inspected to predict their suitability for breeding. When a marriage contract was drawn up, It could include chillingly precise descriptions of a bride's physical condition, her dowry value, and even her expected obedience. These were not isolated cases, but a continent-wide system that operated from royal palaces down to village huts. Perhaps the most disturbing element of this context is how normal it all was. Medieval men and women grew up inside a system that told them this was natural, holy, and eternal. A daughter expected from birth that she would be bartered away. A father accepted without question that his child could secure him wealth or safety. A priest performed the ceremonies that turned children into wives with the conviction that he was serving God. The result was a society where the cruelty of marriage was invisible to those inside it, because the framework of law, theology, and custom made it appear not only legitimate but sacred. The brutality of wedding nights, the inspections, the public consummations, the humiliations, could only exist because of this foundation. And once you understand that foundation, you realize that every whispered fairy tale of medieval romance hides a shadow, a silence, and a suffering that was woven into the very fabric of the age. This is the backdrop against which every medieval wedding unfolded, a world where women's bodies were bargaining chips, where childhood was auctioned off under the seal of religion, and where marriage was nothing more than a stage for demonstrating control. And it is from within this chilling context that the most terrifying secrets of medieval wedding nights begin to emerge. In medieval Europe, marriage was never built on love, but on ownership. This idea was transformed into everyday rituals and practices that stripped young girls of their dignity long before their lives as wives had even begun. Marriage contracts, preserved in fragments across monasteries and noble archives, read less like promises of companionship and more like ledgers of transaction, recording the value of the bride in terms of dowry, fertility, and obedience. A girl was examined the way animals were at the market. Her teeth inspected for health, her hips measured for childbearing, her virginity tested by midwives who acted not as protectors but as gatekeepers of the deal. These degrading examinations were normalized by the church and reinforced by legal codes, creating an atmosphere where human beings were reduced to breeding stock in the eyes of family, husband, and community. One cannot overstate the brutality of this system when seen through the eyes of the young girls themselves. From as early as 6 years old, noble daughters were formally betrothed to men decades older than them, their childhood erased by the stroke of a quill and the seal of wax pressed upon a contract. By the time they were 12 or 13, they were considered of marriageable age, though often they were still physically and emotionally children. The younger a girl was, the more valuable she became to wealthy merchants or noble lords, not because her youth was cherished, but because her body was malleable, easily broken into submission, and more capable of producing a long line of heirs. For parents, especially those facing poverty or political insecurity, selling a daughter into such an arrangement was not an act of cruelty in their eyes but of survival, a way of buying safety or influence in a world where family alliances meant everything. Consider the case of Margaret Beaufort, the mother of Henry VII, who was married off at the age of 6, remarried at 9, and pregnant at 13. Her story is often told in sanitized history books as an example of dynastic power, but stripped of the myth, it reveals the horror of a child transformed into a political tool, her body forced to endure pregnancies before it had even finished growing. And Margaret was not alone. This was the rule rather than the exception for countless girls across Europe, from the grand halls of aristocracy to the cottages of peasants who saw their daughters as one of the few assets they could exchange for survival. It was a society where innocence had no value except as a commodity, where the very vulnerability of children was weaponized against them. The cruelty did not end with the sale itself. Once a contract was signed, a girl's fate was sealed, and the preparations for marriage often included rituals designed to train her into obedience. Religious teachings instructed girls that their bodies were not their own, that pain in marriage was divinely ordained, and that resistance was not only sinful, but an act of rebellion against God. Instructional texts written by clerics and physicians outlined methods for enduring pain, hiding tears, and presenting an obedient face to one's husband, no matter how old, violent, or demanding he might be. Girls were told from the moment they could understand language that their worth would be measured not by their minds, their talents, or their desires, but by their silence, their fertility, and their ability to endure humiliation without resistance. The medical dimensions of this abuse were equally chilling. Physicians of the time described preparing brides for their wedding nights with invasive procedures meant to ready their bodies for consummation. These were not acts of care but of violation, rituals that reinforced the idea that a child's body was merely raw material to be shaped into a wife. In the rare cases where a girl's body broke under the strain, where she died from internal injuries, from childbirth before maturity, or from the infections that followed, the tragedy was not recognized as the result of abuse but as evidence of divine will, a price paid to maintain the order of society. In this way, the system perpetuated itself by hiding its brutality beneath layers of religious justification and medical pseudoscience. What makes this reality even more horrifying is that it was not hidden at the time. Communities witnessed these processes openly, and marriage contracts often described in cold, transactional language the expectations placed upon child brides. The public nature of the system meant that everyone, priests, parents, neighbors, even children themselves, was complicit in a cycle of exploitation that transformed wedding nights into anticipated spectacles. There was no escape for these girls because there was no private space, no alternative narrative, no cultural imagination that allowed for the idea that they might deserve autonomy or safety. To be born female in medieval Europe was, in many ways, to be born into a preordained sentence, where the conclusion of your childhood was not freedom or discovery, but a ritualized transfer of ownership culminating in the terrors of the marriage bed. This section of history is often softened by modern historians who focus on exceptional tales of courtly love or royal romance, but the overwhelming weight of evidence, from contracts, court cases, and medical treatises, reveals something much darker. Marriage was not a partnership, but an institution of control, and the wedding night was not the consummation of love, but the beginning of systematic subjugation. As the market of innocence turned children into commodities, it prepared the stage for what came next, the public ceremonies of degradation that turned private trauma into community entertainment. To move further into these secrets is to descend from the cold logic of contracts into the burning humiliation of ritual, where the bedding chamber became not a sanctuary, but a theater of terror. If the marketplace of contracts reduced a girl to an object, then the bedding ceremonies of medieval Europe turned that object into public entertainment. What should have been the most private and intimate moment in a human life was transformed into a carefully choreographed ritual of humiliation designed to break the spirit of the bride and display the dominance of the groom. These ceremonies were not secretive aberrations or isolated acts of cruelty, but widespread practices sanctioned by custom, reinforced by religion, and normalized by the presence of entire communities who gathered to watch. The medieval wedding night was less about consummation than about demonstration, less about union than about control, and in this lies the most terrifying secret of all. The private violation of the body became a public theater of power. The ritual began with the stripping of the bride, often carried out by the female relatives of the groom, whose task was to undress the girl in front of a gathering of guests, servants, and sometimes even strangers who had been invited to witness the event. What was framed as a gesture of welcoming the new wife into her husband's household was in fact an inspection, a ritualized exposure where the girl's nakedness was examined for signs of disease, deformity, or previous sexual activity. Any imperfection, real or imagined, could be grounds for annulment, sending her back to her family in disgrace and leaving her branded as damaged goods. The weight of shame was not only on her, but on her entire household, making resistance impossible and silence the only option. After the undressing came the virginity examination, performed by midwives or matrons who publicly verified that the girl was untouched. This procedure, invasive by design, was less about medical certainty than about spectacle, a staged performance where the reactions of the bride were watched as closely as the results themselves. To weep, to cry out, or to resist was to invite accusations of impurity, as though only guilt could produce such signs of distress. In many cases, the invasive test itself inflicted harm, but any evidence of pain was twisted into proof that the girl had sinned. Virginity was not a condition of the body but a performance of suffering, one where the humiliation of the bride reassured the community that their transaction had been valid and their customs upheld. The bedding itself followed this public trial, and it unfolded not behind closed doors but within a chamber filled with witnesses. The marriage bed was surrounded by relatives, priests, and community members who remained to verify that the union had been consummated. The groom, urged on by shouts of encouragement and laughter, performed the act of ownership while the bride lay exposed, her first sexual experience stripped of privacy and turned into a ritual of domination. Some guests might withdraw before the act was complete, but others stayed to ensure that the bride's body had been broken to the groom's will, and their testimony became as binding as any contract or legal document. This was the heart of medieval marriage, the conversion of a girl into property witnessed and confirmed by the eyes of her community. Even the aftermath was choreographed into ritual. The morning after, blood-stained sheets were displayed before family and neighbors as proof that the bride had been a virgin and that the marriage had been physically sealed. When the evidence was considered insufficient, the consequences could be catastrophic. A lack of blood might result in accusations of adultery, witchcraft, or fraud, charges that carried punishments ranging from annulment and disgrace to execution. Medical texts of the time describe gruesome methods devised to produce artificial bleeding, the insertion of sharp objects, the smearing of animal blood, or other staged interventions, all designed to satisfy the community's demand for visible evidence of purity lost. Here again, the young bride's suffering became a performance, a spectacle staged for the approval of others. The cruelty of these rituals was not confined to elites or nobles, but extended across the social spectrum. Wealthy families sometimes charged admission for outsiders to attend bedding ceremonies, turning their daughters' trauma into a source of revenue and entertainment. Nobles competed to host the most elaborate or shocking spectacles, and travelers from distant lands recorded their horror at the sight of entire villages invited to watch a child's humiliation treated as festival amusement. Peasant families, though lacking the grandeur of noble rituals, still followed the same patterns in simplified form, reinforcing the idea that a woman's body was never her own, but always subject to the scrutiny of her community. What is perhaps most disturbing about these ceremonies is that their brutality was intentional, not accidental. The very purpose was to strip away resistance, to instill in the bride from her very first night as a wife the understanding that her body, her privacy, and her dignity belonged to her husband and to the social order he represented. To cry, to resist, to suffer. All of these responses were expected and desired because they demonstrated that the girl's spirit had been broken and her submission achieved. The wedding night was not the beginning of companionship, but the beginning of control. A ritualized breaking in of human property conducted under the guise of holy sacrament. Foreign observers often wrote with shock about what they witnessed in these ceremonies. A 13th-century Islamic envoy described European marriage customs as resembling slave markets more than sacred unions, remarking that the degradation inflicted upon brides exceeded anything he had seen in societies that Europeans themselves condemned as barbaric. His testimony underscores the fact that what was considered holy duty in medieval Europe appeared as grotesque cruelty to outsiders, revealing how completely normalized the abuse had become within the Christian world. The spectacle of humiliation was the linchpin of the system, for it ensured that the abuse of the wedding night was not a private act that could be denied or resisted, but a communal ritual reinforced by witnesses, documents, and blood. Every guest became complicit. Every ritual sealed the bride's subjugation, and every morning after display reminded her that her suffering was not her secret, but her community's expectation. To step into a medieval wedding night was not to begin a marriage, but to enter a theater of torture, where the applause of neighbors and the sanction of priests converted personal violation into public law, if the wedding night broke a girl's spirit in a single performance. What followed in the years after broke her body and mind in slow motion. Marriage, in the medieval world, was not a contract for companionship, but a life sentence of subjugation, where every stage of a woman's existence was governed by laws that treated her not as a human being, but as a possession. The terror of the bedding ceremonies did not end with the morning display of blood-stained sheets, for the cycle of control continued with relentless pregnancies, sanctioned violence, and the complete erasure of legal personhood. To survive marriage was to endure a lifetime of violations that stretched far beyond that first night, and for most women, survival itself was a rare and fleeting privilege. Pregnancy in the medieval period was less a sign of life than a constant brush with death. Medical records and burial sites alike confirm that 1 in 3 women perished in childbirth, with the numbers even higher for those who were forced into pregnancy before their adolescent bodies were ready. A young bride, often no more than 13 or 14, might be carrying her first child before she had fully matured, her body breaking under the strain of gestation it could not sustain. Those who survived one delivery were expected to conceive again and again, their value measured by the number of sons they could provide, not by the toll the process exacted on their health. Continuous pregnancy left women emaciated, weakened, and vulnerable to infections. Yet the cycle persisted because their individual survival was considered expendable compared to the survival of dynasties and lineages. The dangers of childbirth were exacerbated by the practices of medieval medicine, which often prioritized ritual and spectacle over safety. Physicians believed that pain and blood loss during labor were signs of God's punishment for Eve's sin, and they prescribed bloodletting at the very moment a woman most needed strength. Midwives were pressured to deliver babies in public spaces, using birthing chairs that displayed the mother's body to onlookers who interpreted the agony as both divine justice and reassurance of legitimate lineage. Instruments were crude, procedures unsanitary, and deaths frequent, yet these tragedies did nothing to alter the system because the suffering of women was never measured against the needs of men and society. Instead, every loss was reframed as the will of God, a divine price extracted from women for the preservation of order. Beyond the terror of reproduction lay the legalized violence of marriage itself. The doctrine of coverture erased a woman's legal identity the moment she married, merging her existence entirely with that of her husband. She could not own property, sign contracts, or refuse his sexual demands. In effect, she ceased to exist as an independent person and became an extension of his will. The law codified this authority in shocking ways, permitting husbands to beat their wives as long as the instrument used was not larger than the thickness of a thumb, the so-called rule of thumb, that reduced the limits of cruelty to a matter of inches. Even this minimal boundary was more symbolic than real, for enforcement was virtually non-existent, and most women endured regular beatings as a routine aspect of domestic life. Worse still, the husband's right over his wife extended to her very life. Under medieval law, men could legally kill their wives under accusations of adultery, witchcraft, or treason, charges so vague they could be applied to any form of disobedience. A woman who refused intimacy might be branded adulterous with imagined lovers. One who sought herbal remedies for pain might be condemned as a witch, and one who asserted independence might be deemed guilty of treason against her husband's authority. In each case, the penalty could be fatal, and the law provided protection not for the wife, but for the man who destroyed her. The thin veil of sacrament that cloaked marriage was in reality a license for domination, a structure that gave men unrestricted power to discipline, confine, or annihilate their wives without consequence. The economic trap was as tight as the legal one, for marriage contracts transferred all a woman's property, inheritance, and earning potential to her husband the moment vows were exchanged. If she fled an abusive household, she had no legal right to sustenance, no means of supporting herself, and no claim to her children, who were considered the property of their father. Those who attempted to escape were often hunted down and returned by authorities who saw them not as victims, but as stolen possessions that needed to be restored to their rightful owner. The system created a prison without walls, where survival depended not on freedom but on submission, and where death often became the only true release. The psychological toll of such marriages was devastating. Letters and chronicles describe women withdrawing from all social contact, succumbing to what was called melancholia, or marriage madness, a condition that left them silent, repetitive in behavior, and incapable of functioning. Modern psychology would recognize these symptoms as trauma, dissociation, and complex grief. But in the medieval world, they were simply seen as inevitable signs of female weakness. Women who lost themselves within these conditions were not pitied, but ignored, their suffering serving as yet another warning to others of what resistance or despair could lead to. Those who lived long enough to become widows faced immediate pressure to remarry, for an unmarried woman was seen as a danger to the order of society, her very autonomy viewed as a threat. It is here, in the years that followed the wedding night, that the full horror of medieval marriage becomes clear. What began as ritual humiliation on the marriage bed unfolded into a lifetime of physical violation, repeated pregnancies, sanctioned violence, and the slow erasure of the self. Marriage was not a milestone to be celebrated, but a sentence to be endured, and for countless women across medieval Europe, that sentence ended not in freedom but in an early grave. The cycle was systematic, intentional, and reinforced by every institution of power, ensuring that the terror of the first night was only the beginning of a far deeper abyss. The most haunting reality about medieval marriage is not only the violence and humiliation endured by countless women, but also the deliberate concealment of this system by those who came after. For centuries, historians, clerics, and political leaders engaged in a systematic campaign of erasure, transforming 1,000 years of intimate slavery into a sanitized narrative of chivalry, courtly romance, and noble love. The very institutions that had once orchestrated the degradation of women worked tirelessly to hide the evidence of their complicity, burying documents, burning records, and rewriting history until the true nature of medieval marriage lay hidden beneath a veneer of myth. What remains for us today is not the raw horror experienced by generations of women, but a distorted image carefully polished to reassure modern society that the past was more romantic, more honorable, and less monstrous than it truly was. The Catholic Church was at the center of this concealment. Having presided over and sanctified the rituals of child marriage, bedding ceremonies, and spousal domination for centuries, it could not allow future generations to see how thoroughly it had turned women into property under the banner of divine order. When the Council of Trent in the 16th century redefined the requirements for marriage, thousands of earlier documents were quietly destroyed or sealed in Vatican archives, their contents deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. Diaries of priests who had confessed their horror at blessing child brides, marriage contracts that read like livestock sales, and medical treatises describing procedures to prepare children for sexual initiation were systematically erased or restricted to the eyes of a few scholars. The silence that followed was not accidental but orchestrated, a way of protecting the authority of the Church by ensuring that its darkest role in domestic life remained hidden. Secular scholars of the Renaissance and Enlightenment continued this campaign of suppression, though their motives were often shaped by cultural pride as much as by religious loyalty. Humanist writers like Giovanni Boccaccio and later historians such as Edward Gibbon presented medieval Europe through the lens of progress and civilization, emphasizing the beauty of courtly love while conveniently ignoring the brutality encoded in marriage law. Their works became the foundations of modern historical memory, shaping the textbooks and cultural myths that define how most people imagine the Middle Ages today. Romantic tales of knights and ladies, troubadours and secret lovers, eclipsed the reality that for the vast majority of women marriage was neither romantic nor voluntary, but a sentence of ownership and violation. By silencing the brutality and amplifying the exceptions, these scholars created a false narrative that still persists in the popular imagination. Even in the modern age, institutions have participated in this erasure. Museums proudly display medieval marriage contracts while editing out references to child brides or clauses permitting spousal abuse. Documents that survive in collections like the British Museum or National Archives are often locked away in restricted sections, accessible only to approved academics. Popular culture perpetuates the same distortions, filling television screens and novels with images of noble weddings and gallant love stories, while ignoring the systematic abuse that defined the experience of marriage for most women of the time. What has been presented to the world is not history but mythology, a comforting tale that disguises the violence of the past beneath a mask of honor. The consequences of this concealment reach into our own time. By erasing the systematic abuse of medieval marriage, history has obscured the origins of practices and beliefs that continue to harm women today. The idea that a wife owes obedience to her husband, that her body is not her own, or that suffering in marriage is somehow sacred, all trace back to doctrines forged in the Middle Ages. Modern systems of domestic abuse, legal inequities, and cultural expectations are not accidents of the present, but echoes of patterns established long ago. To confront these shadows is not merely to understand the past, but to recognize how its logic still shapes the structures of power in our lives. And yet, in recovering the hidden truths of medieval marriage, we are confronted with more than the cruelty of the past. We are confronted with the resilience of the women who endured it. Though their voices were silenced, their letters, their diaries, and the scars left upon their communities testify to a strength that refused to vanish entirely. Some resisted quietly, retreating into prayer or melancholy as small acts of refusal. Others passed down whispered stories of suffering that survived despite every effort to erase them. Their endurance, though rarely celebrated in history books, represents a defiance of the system that sought to destroy them. By bringing their realities to light, we honor not only their pain, but also their unyielding survival. The terrifying secrets of medieval wedding nights, then, are not simply relics of a brutal past. They are warnings, reminders of how easily institutions can sanctify abuse, how quickly communities can transform suffering into entertainment, and how thoroughly history can be rewritten to hide the crimes of power. To look back is to see the abyss beneath the myths we have inherited, and to recognize that every freedom enjoyed today, the right to choose a partner, to refuse abuse, to claim legal independence, was bought with centuries of suffering endured by women who had none of those rights. The forgotten voices call us to vigilance, reminding us that the myths of romance can always conceal the machinery of domination. As this story closes, you are left with the unsettling knowledge that the Middle Ages were not an age of love, but an age of systemic cruelty disguised as sacrament. And while we can take comfort in the freedoms of our own time, the shadows of that system remain, urging us never to forget that the past was far darker than the tales we were taught, and that only by uncovering these buried truths can we ensure they are never repeated.